Hello and welcome to the Bible Study Rewind for the Church of Christ for the last Bible study we had on Sunday in late October. We're in Deuteronomy chapter 7, and I thought we were going to get through that really quick and get into chapter 8, but we stayed in chapter 7, and so I'm going to go over a little bit of what I talked about a little bit last week, but mostly I'm just going to go over what some of the other Bible study students said in the class, just to bring us up to speed before we get into chapter 8. If you want to know anything about the Bible study so far, anything in Deuteronomy up to this point has been posted in both our YouTube channel and our Facebook page as well. You can go there and find those there if you want to catch up. So we're in the very last part of chapter 7, verses 17 through 26. I'm going to just go ahead and read the whole thing, read my comments on it very quickly, and then go over what was said in the Bible study at the church building. So we start in Deuteronomy chapter 7, starting at verse 17. It says, and again, just to bring us up to speed, God is talking to his people about going into the land and taking over the land and taking it for a possession for themselves. They are to dispossess specific people, completely wipe out specific people. And we got into quite a discussion about how that worked when they got there. In some cases, they were to completely wipe them out. In other cases, they were to just overcome them and chase them out of the land. So it says, verse 17, if you shall say in your heart, now he's going to talk a lot about the heart and a lot about forgetting and all that sort of stuff. These nations are more plentiful than I. How can I throw them out? You shall not be afraid of them, remembering you shall remember that which Jehovah your God has done to Pharaoh and to all Egypt. The great trials which your eyes have seen, and the miracles and the wonders, and the mighty hand and the stretched out arm, which Jehovah your God has brought you out. So Jehovah your God shall do to all the peoples of whose face you are afraid. And Jehovah your God shall send the hornets among them, until the ones who are left perish. Even those who hide themselves from your face. You shall not tremble before them, for Jehovah your God is among you, a mighty and fearful God. And Jehovah your God will clear out all those nations before you by little and little. You may not consume them all at once, lest the beasts of the field increase upon you. And Jehovah your God shall deliver them before you and destroy them with a great destruction until they are exterminated. And he shall give their kings into your hand, and you shall destroy their name from under the heavens. No man shall be able to stand before you until you have destroyed them. And you shall burn the carved images of their gods with fire, and you shall not lust after the silver and gold on them, nor shall you take it to yourself, that you not be snared by it, for it is an abomination to Jehovah. And you shall not bring an abomination into your house, and you shall not be a cursed thing like it. You shall utterly detest it, and you shall utterly hate it, for it is a cursed thing. So, wow. So there you go. Real quickly, this is what I said about those things last week, I think, as well. This idea of utterly destroying was basically removing the people's influence in the land, removing their name and the memory of what they did. And just remember, these people were doing some very terrible things in their worship to their gods, their idols. They were sacrificing children and doing all sorts of things we don't need to even talk about at this point. Just know that it was pretty bad. So the questions are, what does God give the people to overcome their fear when they go into the conquer the land? How would these things help the people? How do these things help us have faith and not fear? Well, God gave them faith. That was my basic answer when I first saw this. God, in Deuteronomy, we have already seen that they've defeated the giants in the land, and they've already done that. So God is instilling the faith in them in this group. By this time, after wandering around in the desert, have become faithful, and God is seeing them that way. And He still has issues with what He knows they're going to do, but He's given them faith, and He's given them proof of God's physical protection. Pharaoh being tested, He showed them signs, very terrible signs and miracles. He's showing God's strength. He's showing His own strength. He's telling them, He will send hornets into the peoples who are hiding, the people who get away, and He will be the one defeating these nations. He is the one with the strength. And nothing has changed even since this time. It's still the same today in the Christian paradigm. We don't rely on ourselves. We may be the messenger, but we are not the source of the message. We are only relaying the message. The source of the message is from God, and if we're persecuted for it, then like the apostles, we rejoice for those things, which seems weird, but that's the truth of the matter. Our strength still dwells in God, not in ourselves and His Word, and we have these things as a historical testimony to bolster our own faith even today. So what is God's message? Well, idols of the conquered nations were to be destroyed completely. Anything of value found in the sanctuary was to be destroyed as well. It was not to be taken as plunder. These items were considered an abomination. I think I talked about that last week. And they were cursed by God. So if you bring it into your home, you're making your home a cursed place. You're cursing yourself. So these things were disgusting. The word abomination just means disgusting morally, and it's to be abhorred, especially when it comes to idolatry. And those things that are cursed were just to be removed. Okay, so what did some of the other Bible students say in our class? We talked a little bit about God not being a tyrant. We talked about it the week before as well. And basically all souls belong to God. These were people committing some very terrible things that God needed to eradicate. He didn't want their influence on His people. And God just simply didn't want them to fail. And then in the later books, we see Joshua talking to them about this very same thing. They were supposed to destroy all these things. And when you want to see about who they were supposed to destroy completely and what other instructions they were supposed to do with specific people, we find that later in Joshua as well. One of the things that was brought up was the intermarrying was not supposed to happen to these nations because it was going to influence them against God. And it does eventually. And this is something that was very important to them. And the intermarrying thing is not specifically spelled out in the New Testament, but I think it just stands to reason that when we're thinking of marriage, having the same beliefs, the same worldview, the same what is important to each of us before you marry somebody is a good idea, and I think that's just an important concept, regardless of time, whether it was back then or whether it was even today. By Judges chapter 3, with some 30 or 40 years after Joshua's time, we see we see them intermarrying, and things are starting to go south very quickly. Okay, so here are some other statements. God was reminding them that it's His strength that's helping them. They were not alone, and God will take an active role with them in this time where they are really expected to do some extraordinary things. And this is something that I try to iterate when I'm in there, that this was not an easy thing for them. They were not, this was a strange place. They were fighting against people who were well established. And so God's reminding them, I'm the one who's doing all this for you, so just don't worry about it. Have faith, do not fear, and that God is just, and that as long as they loved Him and exhibited that love through their obedience, God would love them back. He would show His mercy on them, and He would help them, and He would help them prosper, and He does do that. Even through a lot of years where they weren't so faithful to Him, He is long-suffering. And when you read through the Old Testament, you see that. He is absolutely long-suffering. Okay, gods were viewed as weapons, and God doesn't say they will do it. He says He will do this, and He separates Himself from all the other gods who never did anything. They were perceived to bring blessings and good harvests and rain or whatever, but God is actually showing Himself. He is physically revealing Himself to a degree with these people which no other God had ever done. But the people were still required to do their part. They were still required to go in and do these things. They were the hand of God, if you will. And in the same way with the same concept, Christians are still the hand of God in the Christian paradigm, where we exhibit mercy and thanksgiving and thoughtfulness and carefulness, and we are always seeking to help those who need help, who are looking for God anyway. If people aren't looking for God, you can't do much for them. Eventually, God does become known, although maybe not fully, and that's true not only with the surrounding people, but maybe even with Israel to a certain degree. This was a step-by-step process that was to take time. This moment was to direct their ways to the future. We're going to get into a little bit of what that means here in a minute. Humans learn by doing. God teaches us at our level. And we understand physical and some spiritual, and God is, of course, a spiritual being. And He is far above anything that we can imagine or know completely. And adhering to God, to His Word, is simply the first step to coming to know Him. This was really manifested in David's life, that obedience is that first step to coming to that love of God and understanding His purity and His righteousness and how that makes you that way. Okay, Moses repeated these things to them because they were forgetful, and forgetfulness tends to lead away from humility, and that's exactly what happens throughout the Bible. When it could be foreign kings who knew God, but they didn't completely know God, and they didn't have that humility that God was looking for. Guys like Nebuchadnezzar and these sorts of kings who just needed to know God, even though they were foreign kings, and they came to an understanding, but I don't know that they ever knew God completely. Another one of the statements was, don't share in this abomination. Don't share in the abominations of the world. Like when God was talking about, if you find something in a temple, don't take it to your house. And we can extrapolate that into today's application, where we are not to let sin infiltrate our lives, infiltrate our homes, desecrate our children, and let these things ruin our lives. And it's not a whole lot different than it was here. I think it's elevated in the sense that Jesus came and brought us to this knowledge of spiritual living, more of a spiritual living. And I'm not saying they didn't understand spiritual living in the Old Testament, but certainly the fulfillment of God's law, specifically that Jesus didn't need the law, brings everything to a whole different level. And it's the same thing, but the application stays the same. Don't bring sin into your house. If somebody was to bring that silver and gold into their home, they may have just made another idol like they did with the golden calf. And God is a jealous God, and a lot of people put a negative connotation to that. But that's just because God is just. He understands when we're unfaithful. That's when his jealousy gets fired up, is when we're unfaithful, like a husband or a wife is to their spouse. That's where God is. And God isn't guessing. God knows. That's the thing. Sometimes with the plunder, there were different times when we see them going into the land. Sometimes with the plunder of the people, they were allowed to take it. Sometimes they were supposed to give it to God, whatever that meant, maybe to their own sanctuaries or whatever. But God has different rules for the plunder that they are going to get when they get into this land. And so when it comes to these temples and these idols, they were to just get rid of it. And like I mentioned, you see that in Joshua, and later on when they start messing up and not taking care of these things. So another person talked about intermarrying. It was against ideas, and this is important to remember, that ideas are things that begin the sinful issues that a person or a family or entire families can have in their homes. It's the ideas of what people want to tell other people. And in this case, it was simple idolatry. And today we can see simple idolatry throughout our land. It could be, people wanting things all the time, coveting after things, wanting what other people have to the point where they're willing to do unspeakable things about it. Idolatry can happen anywhere. And this idea of not allowing those ideas creep into our heads is very important. Now, I would say that it's good to know what other ideas are, because you need to understand how to defend yourself from it. So when people are teaching their children, and this is all a personal thing, every parent needs to do their own thing. But if children grow up thinking something and they never hear the flip side of what the world is thinking, they may be susceptible to the teachings of the world when they leave your home. Not likely. The scriptures tell us that a child that is brought up, correctly in the teachings of God, will probably not go astray in those things. So that's just my own personal input there. That sometimes, if children don't know about what the world is doing and why they're doing it, coming from us, they'll hear it from somebody else, and those arguments will sound a lot stronger coming from somebody who wants to condemn God. Anyway, that's enough of that. Idols are to be destroyed, but these things in the heart need to be removed and destroyed as well. So we see these applications, even though they happened thousands of years ago, still true today. And somebody brought up that marriage is like Jesus is married to the church. And today, he is the faithful one we are to marry ourselves to. I think that's what he meant. But he did bring that up, that this is how sacred that our association is with God through Jesus. So that covered chapter 7, but somebody had a question and brought up the question in regards to the promised land. Does this promise go away eventually at all? Does it end, is the question. In other words, God promised this land of Canaan to Israel. And so the question is, does it end? Well, my first comment without studying it, because I didn't study it or anything, I just said, well, I think if I was to look for a specific verse that said, and there's a point, at this point, you will never live in Israel again, ever. I don't know that specific verse actually exists. So my answer is, well, I've never read where God said, you will never live in the land again. Where in the Old Testament, there are several references to this forever part. So I left it at that. And I got some other answers, which I think are very thoughtful and poignant. The promise was given to Abraham. The land attainment was fulfilled in the Mosaical times, right now in the scriptures. And although, because they violated the covenant, God removed them from the land. So we see that God can remove them from the land, absolutely. And he tells them, you will come back. But the emphasis is, like in Jeremiah, it's more than just the land. And we see these things happening where we have messianic promises. Now, to the Jew, he would have thought he's talking about the land. But to the Christian and the rest of the world, he's talking about a very spiritual thing. He's talking about a real forever thing. Not the earth. The earth itself is not going to be forever. And so he's talking about something not of the world. And with the new covenant comes the emphasis of changes. The Old Testament was a shadow for what was to come spiritually. And Christ fulfills it and establishes the church and does away with the temple. And we see the temple being destroyed in 70 AD. And when this new system, and you go through Romans and Hebrews and anything in the New Testament, we see guys like Paul saying, look, this law is really not necessary, especially, don't bind it on Gentiles. If you're going to practice it, go ahead, but don't even bind it on Gentiles because it's not needed anymore, because the emphasis now is on this spiritual kingdom that God is ushering in. He has taken it to a different level. It's no longer this concept of gaining land and being fruitful and having all kinds of great things. It's not about having great things. It's about having God. That's what Jesus brought into the narrative. It's a spiritual promised land. Today, people attempt to make God's promise a physical one. And I've said this a couple of weeks ago. That's not it. When the Christ comes, it brings a higher consciousness of what God is about, what he's always expected from his people, and how he's expecting to get us there, and how the Christ fits into that, which is he's the propitiation for all the mess ups that we do. And so we don't need that anymore. It isn't about land, it's about spiritual eternity. And these things, this land thing has been way surpassed. So whether that means there's no longer God has to adhere to the deal, right, of giving them the land or not, that's between him and Israel. But I think a lot of the people were saying, I don't think he really needs to. This is all about, the land was about bringing the Christ. Now that the Christ is here, it's about something much more important. And if you're concentrating on the land, you're concentrating on the wrong thing. And that was the class. Thank you for your attention. If you'd like to come, for the classes, we meet on Sunday mornings at 9 o'clock and on Wednesday evenings at 7 o'clock. You're welcome to come. You're welcome to come. Thank you for your attention. And we all hope that God will continue to bless us all. Thank you.